You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities. We're glad to be back. It seems like a long break.
It really does.
It seems like it's been forever since we've been in the studio, even though it's only been like 4 weeks.
Right.
That's pretty normal for us, but
We've just had so much happen.
yeah, we've had a lot going on. We're still unpacking. The house. We're in the new place.
It's starting to look more like your home now.
Yeah, it's starting. Yeah, it's still. I don't know how long does it take a house to stop feeling like like someone else's.
Don't ask me. I've never had a house.
Yeah, well, and it a part of that I think is the fact that it does back up to a lake, so it feels like we're in a vacation spot all the time.
Your backyard is gorgeous.
So it's kind of fun.
And you got the new fence in, so you just like look out, and it's beautiful. And yeah, if I had to live in town, which God saved me from living in town, but if I had to, this would be like someplace that I would be interested in.
Yeah.
So that's saying something.
Yeah, that view is really what sold us. But speaking of the new house, the studio room is a little smaller in this place, but I wanted to just take a moment to say thanks to our Patreon supporters because we were able to buy some upgrade our mics, which is nice.
Yes.
And then get these wonderful stands that clip to the desk. So
which I love.
We have all the floor space here. So for our YouTube viewers, you can see we can move our hands freely and not have to worry about hitting a mic stand.
Maybe my feet won't fall asleep.
Yeah, you're also not just looking down a mic stand at us. We're able to get rid of the pop filters.
Yeah,
so you can
see more of our faces.
Yeah.
And but we've got great listeners, great supporters, and we don't expect anything from any of our listeners.
No,
but we appreciate it, and it is such an encouragement. This last week, I'd give a shout out to Linda. She's in the paddle store, and I know she'll hear this episode. She sent me this wonderful solar charger for my phone, chocolate dusted almonds, coffee. It just nothing that she had to do, just being a good friend. And that's kind of how I look at most of our listeners. They become our friends because a lot of them will start to interact with us. And I think I talk to not most, but a lot of our listeners once or twice a week with specific ones,
Yeah.
So there's a lot of conversations that go on, and they aren't just people who exist in some kind of weird abyss of of online whatever. They are real people to us.
Yeah, and definitely thank you so much for the support that makes the upgrading possible. And
yes.
Thanks to Sweetwater for getting the mics for us.
They
They didn't give them to us, but
they shipped them out.
They shipped them to us, got them to us. Yeah, they're doing a great job over there. And these apparently these are hard to get a hold of right now, so it's kind of nice that we got them. But
no, I'm loving it. I'm having to get used to having looked through the stand at you, but
yeah, it's a little different. For us, but it's so much nicer.
It really is. We've been recording 3 minutes, and I'm already happy.
Yeah. So not to spend too much time on that, but I did want to just point out that but we did, and also it's kind of nice getting the TV in here. That was not Patreon supporters. That was an old TV we had in storage. So just so you know, we're not just frivolously spending money, but
that's going to be so nice for the commentarians because I did the last episode watching on a little laptop screen. So this is going to be great. And because you have to read the subtitles when you do commentarians.
Right.
So this will be good.
So but there's that. So let's get into Bible stuff. I know that people aren't here just to hear about the Patreon supporters, but they're fantastic. So
we just want people to know that, they are appreciated. And so last week we kind of ran off the rails and got to talking about some of our own stuff. But we were in the end of chapter 26. That was that parallel chapter to 24. And we were seeing that kind of evolution, for lack of a better word, with David, that maturing, that growing. And he's not really in a great spot right now. But as that chapter draws to a close, David has said that he's really upset that he's being condemned to leave Israel, which basically means he's being condemned to worship other gods. And he even says, now therefore, let not my blood fall to the earth away from the presence of the Lord. So, I mean, he doesn't want to die outside of Israel because that might have spiritual implications for him. And, the idea of not dying in the presence of the Lord, I think we can kind of understand it. We might not understand it geographically, but we understand it from a spiritual perspective today.
Yep.
We want to be in that relationship with the Lord. And in verse 20b, he goes back and he repeats the insults that he said to Saul previously. He kind of rephrases them from chapter 24. But he says, basically no king should behave this way. Saul is not behaving like a king. And he places this blame for the exile squarely on Saul's shoulders because Saul could have made it where David was welcome in Israel. And, he's been questioning up to this point, why did Saul allow this? Was it God who incited him? Was it the people who incited him? Or, is it just Saul's bad attitude? And this time, instead of the dog illustration, he asked if the king's going to come out to seek a single partridge in the mountains. But then Saul says, then I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do you harm. Because my life was precious in your eyes this day, behold, I have acted foolishly and have made a great mistake. And this is the first time we really see any contrition from Saul. It's the first time, always before, whenever he's been confronted with something he's done wrong, he's made a mistake. And think back to the Amalekites and Agag, and the people did it. Here's Samuel, the prophet, who can see straight into his heart, who has this revelation knowledge from God, and Saul still tries to make excuses. So for the first time, we have Saul acknowledging his wrong. And this is the closest we ever get to any kind of admission on his part that he may have wronged David. So in verse 22, David answers and says, here's the spear, O king. Let one of the young men come over and take it. So we talked about how that was a symbol of Saul's authority. So David is not even going to take the symbol of Saul's authority. He's going to return it. And he's showing that he could, in a very symbolic way, take Saul's authority at this point. But he chose not to. And this is very reminiscent of that cutting of the robe where David symbolically disrobed Saul in front of his men.
Right.
And so, but the thing is, with a robe, you can't return a robe. You can return a spear, but not the corner of a robe that's been cut off.
Right.
So, David, he defers to God's rule in this. Saul is God's anointed, and he even prepares to leave God's presence because the authority God's anointed has forced him into the situation. And he says, the Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and his faithfulness. For the Lord has given you into my hand today, and I would not put out my hand against the Lord's anointed. So again, we're hearing that echo of almost the exact same words that David said in chapter 24. God's going to judge, God's going to reward, and he's going to let God do it. He's not going to work out his salvation with his own hand, which is what we saw with David and Abigail. That was her admonition against David whenever he started to kill everyone in Nabal's camp.
Right.
So verse 24, he says, behold, I guess I shouldn't read the same verse twice. But we also see that same sentiment that David has just said echoed in Galatians 6:7. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever one sows, that he will also reap. So David's words are prophetic, at least in the conversation between David and Saul. Saul's going to die, and David's going to live because he allowed Saul to live. And David spared Saul tribulation, and so David's going to be delivered out of this tribulation. And David, he bases his this prophecy or these words in the promises and the character of God. And going right back to, when you go to Deuteronomy and you look at Deuteronomy, it's so full of, if you do this, I will do that.
Right.
And so this is one reason why that book is so crucial, I think, for understanding God's nature, that God really does want to reward those who obey him. And this is setting us up for what's going to happen in chapter 28 and talking about how God deals with Saul in those last days. But we aren't there yet. I know this is a passage everybody's ready for us to get to because that's the Witch of Endor stuff.
Right.
So,
yeah, that's very, very confusing passage.
Oh, yeah. We're going to spend some time on that one because I had to pick through a lot of threads. So, verse 25. Then Saul said to David, "Blessed be you, my son David. You will do many things, and you will succeed in them." So David went his way, and Saul returned to his place. So David's going to leave and join the Philistines for a while. And he doesn't seem to believe Saul's words enough to stay in Israel. He seems to believe, based on his actions, that he is going to have to completely remove himself from Saul's sphere of influence. He's got to get out of any place where Saul has any kind of authority. And Saul doesn't pursue him. Saul just accepts his fate. So he goes back. He goes back home at that point. So the two part ways. This is the last time they're going to talk. We're not going to see them together again. And it's kind of a sad story because we have to remember, with everything that's passed, this all began with David serving in Saul's courts. David was a source of comfort and a source of peace for Saul, and everything has been turned on its head. And now, Saul has been chasing David all over the mountains with an army of 3,000 men. And it really is, it's a sad time because this isn't just wicked King Saul. This is the man who kind of became David's surrogate father in a lot of ways.
Right.
So I think we forget sometimes that David did not hate Saul. And he's not just behaving properly towards Saul because it's the right thing to do. David really does have an affection towards him. So we're moving into chapter 27. This is a really, really troubling period of David's life. It's so troubling that the writer of Chronicles just completely ignores it. Doesn't even want it recorded in the history. The only reference really that we have to the events of chapter 27 in the book of Chronicles is Chronicles 12:1, 1 Chronicles 12:1, and it tells us that Ziklag became the property of David because of Saul. But beyond that, we aren't given any kind of details. But we got to remember, the book of Samuel was written to support the Davidic monarchy, but it was also to even question the idea of having a monarchy.
Right. And that was also one of the things that on Understanding Sin and Evil. Sorry, I couldn't think of the name of Miriam Brand's show. That was one of the things that she talked about with 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. It was written during the exilic period to answer the question of, well, if we're God's chosen people, why are we in exile?
Right.
And the answer is because here's a chronicle. Well, not chronicle, but here's a here's a record.
History.
Here's a record of how much stuff you screwed up.
Exactly.
So that's if you really need the answer and really want the answer, here's 4 scrolls worth of just messed up stuff
that you have done, that your ancestors have done, that you're still having to work out. Then conversely, you have Chronicles, which was written, why should you come back?
Yeah.
Why return to this place that you got kicked out of?
And then Chronicles, it goes into, well, look how great the monarchy was.
Exactly. And so you have these opposing views. And the thing is, despite the fact you've got opposing views, it's not contradictory. It's how you frame something. And I mean, right now we just went through the election, and I'm not going to comment on who should win or why. That's beside the point. How you interpret the results of the election and whether it's good or bad depends on your framework, even if you acknowledge the same facts. So, but that, I mean, I'm just using it because it's a handy example. Again, we don't get political.
Not endorsing any candidates here.
Well, one social taboo of talking about religion is enough. We don't need another one. So, but the reason why this is so troubling is David is living with the Philistines. I mean, these are the sworn enemies of Israel. The whole purpose of having a king is to defeat the Philistines. And here's David, the guy who's been anointed king, and he's living with them. And supposedly he's fighting with the Philistines. We're going to talk about what's going on there as we get into the chapter. But also David is repeatedly lying to the Philistines in this chapter. And we never know what David's motivations are if you stay in the moment. Now, if you go forward, you can read back into this chapter. But if we stay within this chapter in the context of it, we have to just kind of go with what the writer's presenting us. But he really works to stay in the good graces of this Philistine, and he does that through his lies. He accepts gifts from the king of the Philistines, most notably the city of Ziklag. David is said to kill men, women, and children in his raids simply because it's the smart military strategy. We're going to talk about that some.
Fun.
Oh, yeah. We don't have any reference for God in this entire chapter. None. David never appeals to God. He never makes a request of God. He never seeks guidance. And so that's problematic.
Yeah, I do find it really weird that the king would just give him a whole city.
Isn't it, though? I mean, I think it really kind of comes down to the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yeah. And, Saul was supposed to be this king's enemy. And Saul had been publicly anointed by Samuel. And remember, during Samuel's lifetime, the Philistines, they stayed in check. They didn't have a problem with them. And it wasn't until Saul came to the throne that we start having active conflict between the two nations.
Yeah.
So Saul really is their enemy in their eyes. And do they know that David's anointed to be king? We don't know.
Right.
And we know that in Israel, hey, it's starting to get out.
Yeah.
But how much do the Philistines know?
Well, I thought they knew because when David was pretending to be to be mad earlier in the book, didn't one of the Philistines say, "Isn't this supposed to be their leader?" or something of that effect?
Yeah, that's chapter 21, and is not this David king of the land? And that's verse 11. Did he not sing? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul struck down his thousands, and David in his 10,000s. So, and when we talked about whether that was just because he had won that battle against Goliath, he was a great warrior. He had won many battles after that by the time he gets to Gath. But did they know about the anointing, or did they think it just didn't stick? I mean,
I don't know. It's just weird. It's a whole weird saga.
And it really is. And I was actually talking to Joshua Sherman this week, and he said something along the lines of, he forgets how weird our faith is sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, part of the reason we have the show called Faith and Other Oddities.
Emphasis on the oddities, which, is kind of us. But but that's the fun part about this. It's never a bland story. And I think sometimes whenever you grew up in church and you got the little watered down Sunday school lessons, you got the 20-minute sermon that really didn't dive into this, you forget that this is a whole different. I mean, it could start out with that Star Wars beginning, in a galaxy far, far away, because that's what it feels like if we really stop to examine it. So in verse 1 of chapter 27, David accepts that Saul is not going to give up. And so he leaves Israel, and he sees it as a way of removing himself from Saul's lands. And he decides, like I said, to go into the land of the Philistines. And it's striking that the author provides absolutely no commentary about this move on David's part. He doesn't condemn it. He doesn't approve of it. He just records it. And so we don't know what the writer of Samuel thought about these events. We're not told whether God approves of it or God disapproves of it. We're just told that David does it. And the really interesting part is we are told what David is thinking. And remember, we very rarely get what David's thinking until we go over into the Psalms. And we're told that then David said in his heart. And this could be a clue, or it could be me overreaching, because so I want to make that clear. Throughout this book, the one person that we do know what he's thinking all the time is Saul, and we're always being told what Saul's thinking. We aren't being a clue as to what David is thinking, and I kind of wonder if the writer's kind of hinting that David's still making that struggle with what kind of king is he going to be. And we've talked about that in the previous stories, how we've been seeing evidences that David might be taking on some of the characteristics of Saul, particularly when he threatened to kill the whole camp of Nabal and just destroy everybody who stood in his way. We talked about whether he was going to be a judge or not. But now we have this very Saul-like phrase used in connection to David. And so I think the writer is trying to show us, and again, that's me thinking this. I'm not seeing this with anybody else. The writer is trying to show us we still have to answer the question, what kind of king is David going to be? Is he going to be like Saul, or is he going to be the king that God desires? And it's not just a question that we as a reader have to confront. I think this is very much a question that David himself was having to confront. Mm-hmm. Because it's very easy to take on the methods and manners of your boss. If you've been trained to do a job by somebody who does it a particular way, you tend to do it that same way. And David's been with Saul, and this was how Saul was a king. Mm-hmm. So
yeah, that makes sense.
I hope it does, but that's why this is the fun part. It's like you have to take these little clues and look at them, and you have to be careful not to read too much into them. And that's the hard part, because you don't want to overreach, but you don't want to miss something in the silence. So verse 2, David arose and went over, and he and 600 men who were with him to Achish, the son of Maoch, the king of Gath. So David leaves Israel. He's got 600 guys with him, and he goes to Gath. Now, David's already been to Gath, as we referenced earlier, back in chapter 21, verses 10 through 15. And the king had driven him out because David had pretended to be mad. So, the question there is, why does David expect this time to be different? And there's a few possible answers. At this time, he's arriving with his family and an army. He's not just coming in as a single individual. He could be looked at as a possible resource, as we said, that enemy of my enemy thing. And so it could be that the king of Gath at this point thought that David was going to join his side. And
yeah. Well, it even says so later in the chapter that where is it? So Dave, I got to find it.
One of those verses.
And Achish trusted David, thinking he has made himself an utter stench to his people, Israel. Therefore, he shall always be my servant. So there, it definitely is kind of that part of it. It might also be that because David did show up with 600 people, it's like, well, it's not going to be as easy to just kill him.
Right. Yeah, you can't just drive out 600 people as easily as one guy.
A little bit more of a fight there.
And especially knowing that, these are experts in guerrilla mountain warfare. And they've already proven that. And so not easy guys to dismiss. Another reason could be this might be a different king. We did not have that son of Maoch at the first chapter, and so, or in the 21st chapter. And, Achish could have been a very common name among the Philistines. How many people do we know named John?
Sure.
So it could have also been another title for the king. Like we discussed, Ahimelech might be, or Abimelech, sorry. Ahimelech was the priest. Abimelech might be a title. So It's not uncommon, even today, for rulers to have a couple of different titles to refer to the same position, especially if they're exalted positions. So we are also being told that, they came with their families. And so the fact that they brought their families with them may make it seem like it was less of an attack and more of a migration or immigration situation. So we're going to show kindness to the refugees. And so verse 3, I'm not going to read it. Actually, it gives us this list of things that comes with them. Wives, children, the elderly, slaves, and any domestic livestock, they're traveling with them. Is that actually in the verse, or did I just insinuated that from from reading the verse? Sorry, I slept since I wrote these notes, and so that winds up translating to not remembering everything. So everything, man in his household. So again, children, elderly, the livestock, all of that would have been with them, and the children and the livestock in particularly, and even the women, would have been seen as wealth. And they would have been seen as something that you would want to add to your land. And the the fun thing is, if you start to look at the numbers, I mean, like just conservatively
Mhm.
looking at the numbers, assume that for every one of the 600 men, there's 3 other people with him, or he represents a group of 3. You got
And
1,800.
that's a very small family. Like
Yeah,
a family
ridiculously
of 4 is
small.
very small for the time.
Yeah, ridiculously small. But I mean, 1,800 people. The town we grew up in is 600 people alone.
Mhm, mhm.
And so this is a big migration of people. I don't care who you are.
Right.
Because 1,800, I mean, it would have been probably twice or 3 times that easily. So we're also told that David brings his 2 wives, Ahinoam.
Yeah, I did notice that they're specifically named in the
Mhm.
group.
Yes, they are singled out. Uh, Ahinoam of Jezreel is a geographic marker. We got Abigail of Carmel, so we got the geographic marker with her, but also Nabal's widow is how the ESV translate it. It actually says the wife of Nabal, so she's still being considered, which goes back to
The
the
Levirate,
exactly,
Levirate marriage possibilities.
exactly. So this is a support of that idea. So verse 4, and when it was told to Saul that David had fled to Gath, he no longer sought him. So Saul's given up. David's out of his reach. The funny thing about this verse, Saul's job as a king was to fight the Philistines.
Mhm.
Saul's single-minded purpose as a king was to kill David. And yet he is so reluctant to do what God has commanded him to do. He won't even chase his sworn enemy into the Philistine land.
Well, when I read that, I look at it and go, well, that just makes sense, because now if you're going to go to get the Philistines, you got to go through David, or if you're going to get David, you're going to have to go through the Philistines. So he's fighting like a double-fronted battle, basically.
That's the problem. Saul always does what makes sense. He always does what's expedient. He always does what benefits him the most at the expense of obedience. And
Okay.
so he's not willing to face the Philistines, even when it aligns with his own purposes. But I mean, think back to the Amalekites. Whenever he spared the best animals, he spared the king.
Mhm.
Just because that was something that was going to benefit him, and it was not obedience. Or when he offered the sacrifice, when he shouldn't have offered the sacrifice, he should have waited on Samuel. Saul is very much about what he thinks is going to work in the moment for his benefit,
Right.
and forget everything else. And
Well, speaking of all that, if we continue in the chapter here, it says that David kills the women and children and
Mhm.
takes the donkeys and takes the donkeys and the camels and the garments and the
Mhm.
oxen and the sheep.
Mhm.
I mean, he does basically what Saul did.
yeah,
But
he does.
There's no mention of whether or not it's okay or not.
Right. And I think the big difference there, Saul had direct orders.
Well, I know Saul had direct orders.
Yeah.
But it's also,
It's like, was there double standard?
yeah. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out, is like, why is it okay for David to take the stuff? I get Saul had direct
Mhm.
orders, but oftentimes don't we kind of extrapolate, like, from one situation, maybe we should do the same thing here? I don't know. It's
This is a really good question, and this is one of the reasons why this chapter is so problematic. It's why Chronicles doesn't bring it up, because David is acting very much like Saul at this point in time.
right. Which is really, I mean, I get, of course, why the writer of Chronicles wouldn't bring it up, but it is funny that it's not brought up because, I mean, how many problematic characters do we have in the Bible already? A ton. So what's
we
one
start
more?
out with Adam.
What's one more episode, right?
Yeah. We start with Adam being problematic, and we go right through John writing Revelation, and we have some problems with the person of John, as much as we appreciate what he did. So yeah, but there's just no way of getting around how just troubling and disturbing this passage has been for everyone.
Mhm.
And it's a problem for us today. It was a problem for the rabbis. And again, like I said, the writer of Chronicles, still a problem. And so we we get to see that there is this tendency, and it's a human tendency that stretches across all eons. We don't like whenever our heroes wear gray hats.
Right.
You know,
right.
and there's a name for something, heroes in gray hats. But I mean, that's
No, I get what you're saying.
yeah, and we want everything to be simple and systematic, and being able to have those clear-cut boundaries. And God doesn't operate like that. He is very relational. And I think that's one of the things that David's story demonstrates for us, because God's response to David is based on the relationship.
Right.
And ultimately, I think that is what it comes down to, is Saul never had the relationship. And we're going to see how the writer of Samuel just knocks that one right on the head and reveals that Saul never had the relationship.
Mm.
And so, but we'll get there. So, verse 5, then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be given to me in one of the country towns, that I may dwell there. For why should your servant dwell in the royal city with you? So very much, David's offering this wonderful politicized speech.
Mm-hmm.
It's very correct. He's able to flatter and ask exactly for what he wants. The writer very subtly connects this back to Ruth, and later on, the writer of Esther is going to pick up this whole theme too. If I found favor in your eyes, and the idea of asking for what you want, that when you find favor, you can ask for what you want. And so, I'm not going to go into it today, but I think we've seen other areas where Ruth and Esther are very much connected with the book of Samuel. Ruth was David's great-great-grandmother, and there might be another great in there. I don't remember for sure. But then Esther is connected because Esther and Mordecai are from the tribe of Benjamin, the same tribe as Saul.
Mm-hmm.
And they face, oh my goodness, who's the bad guy in Esther?
Xerxes?
No, that's the king.
Haman.
Haman, the Agagite, who is supposed to traditionally be the descendant of King Agag.
Gotcha.
So the books are very connected. And the other connection to Esther is Saul's kingdom is taken away from him and given to a neighbor who is better than he is, just like the queen at the opening of Esther. Her crown is taken away from her and given to a neighbor who is better than her.
Okay.
So some real good connections there. So he asked, well, I also just saw in my notes that because it is connected to Esther, it also connects us to the book of Daniel and the end of Genesis, where we're talking about Joseph, because those stories, all three of those, are the telling of the same story.
Right.
So David requests a city from the king of Gath, and he makes it sound so humble, but think about it for just a second.
Oh yeah, I mean it's sheer hubris. I mean,
he totally just asks somebody to give him a city.
Some might call it chutzpah.
Right. Which is sovereignty without the crown, which is very much where David is operating. Exactly.
Yeah, it's just insane. Yeah. Yeah. If it's okay with you, I would like a city. I humbly request an entire city.
What would happen if I just wrote to the governor of Oklahoma and said, hey, by the way, could I just have a town? Would you mind giving me one?
They might give you one. I don't know. There are plenty that, I mean, have nothing going on.
This is true.
And I'm not saying there's a slight to any of the towns. I'm saying there are actually like abandoned towns.
Yeah, like ghost towns, pretty much.
Ghost towns in Oklahoma. Yeah, basically.
But I mean, he did the same thing with Naval, and Naval, who was one of his own tribe, says, I'll kill you first. You're going to take what belongs to me. Then David winds up with everything. So maybe the king of Gath kind of learned something from that. I don't think so, honestly, but it is fun to speculate.
I mean, it may be because the Philistines before, when it came to the ark and all that, they're like, well, when God sent a plague, they're like, hey, before we get any more of these like Egypt did,
right?
Let's get rid of this thing.
Right. They're not stupid. When it comes to their dealings with Israel, I mean, there's a general stupidity because they're taking on God's people.
Right.
But they can be very smart about it. And I'm still, when I I think sometimes when we read through this, it's like, oh, okay, David asked for a city. Da, da, da. No, think about that.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, really, I kind of wonder if there's anybody in the Bible who takes the words, you have not because you ask not, any more seriously than David does.
Hmm.
I mean, David really seems to believe that he can do that. And, the other interesting thing about this, and I thought this was very cool. David is asking the enemy to give him what God had already promised him,
Mhm.
because Ziklag belonged to the territory of Judah. So David is only asking for what is his birthright already.
Right.
And so it's this idea that the enemy has to return what they have taken.
Well, there's that, and then of course then that also kind of ties us back to the brothers Jacob and Esau.
Mhm.
Those brothers, there were two of them, because God already said that this stuff was going to be Jacob's, and then
Right.
Jacob goes in and he lies about things in order to get what should already be his.
Yeah,
mean, it's-
and so in one sense, it's saying, "Hey, I want to see the fulfillment of what God's promised," but on another hand, it's like totally audacious,
Mhm.
and so it kind of makes me wonder. And this is something as I was reading through this, I'm like, we've been taught so often as Christians that the correct thing, the proper thing, is to be so humble that we ask for nothing,
Right.
and where is that line? I mean, should we be asking for more? And I'm not saying, oh, God, give me a private jet or anything like that. But things that God has promised us, are we still asking to see those things fulfilled?
Right.
And so just something to think about. And, I don't want us to go out and think, oh, I'm just going to name it and claim it or blab it and grab it. That don't do that.
I would feel so awkward if I was ever in a position where I was doing some kind of ministry work that required a private jet for some reason, but I don't know what that would be. Like, I can't even think of what it would.
I have no idea. I mean, I could see where it would be like
maybe a private plane to fly people into like remote regions of
like a pedal jumper or something. Yeah.
But for flying around the U.S., I mean, I don't think anyone needs a private jet.
I would
least
love to
not-
find a way to justify it. Don't get me wrong.
Oh, sure. I mean, the only thing I could think is if maybe I got my pilot's license and decided to start a business to finance other things that I want to do. But, apparently that's pretty expensive to get into.
It is because I've looked into it because I love to fly. And so I've got a friend who gets to take us up every so often. He actually offered to help me get my pilot's license if I paid for the fuel. And I looked at the cost of fuel alone and went, oh my goodness.
Hard pass.
Yeah. And it killed me because I would love to fly. That's like one of my favorite things ever. And I like to fly in small planes where you feel it. But anyway, enough about me.
So yeah, we should carry on. So
verse 6. So that day Achish gave him Ziklag, and therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. So from this point on, Ziklag pretty much it's going to appear again. It's going to appear 15 more times in the Bible. And, we first encountered it back in Joshua 15:31. And like I said, it's one of the cities that's listed in the inheritance of Judah. In Joshua 19:5, it's among the cities allotted to Simon. But we remember back in Judges 1, and if you've been following us, we talked about this. Simon and Judah kind of just melded together until they became indistinguishable from each other.
sure.
And Judah became the identifier for everyone in this area. Now, in 1 Chronicles 4:27, we find that Simon did not multiply like Judah, and that's the reason for that melding. And it seems that during this time, during David's reign, when he gets there, that up to that point, Simon had retained enough of a presence within Israel that they had actually maintained some kind of, very small hold on the city itself. But then by the time David gets there, it's completely turned over to Judah. So Nehemiah 11:28, it's our final mention of the city. It's inhabited by the tribe of Judah after the return from exile. And so we really don't know the precise location of Ziklag. I've Becca Lavelle, who is studying archaeology, she gave me some books, and I was like looking in them to see if we can find some kind of information. it's just not there. What we do know is that Gath and Ziklag are far enough removed that David can pretty much do as he pleases without the Philistines knowing. So,
Sure.
it's probably more than a day's walk. It's close enough to several enemies of Israel for David to make routine raids on them.
Yeah. And I also think it's funny that, I mean, real estate laws must have been way different because he says that day he gave it to him. And you're like, yep. I had to wait 30 days to buy a house.
Right?
Just one.
Yeah,
not
just
even
one.
a city.
Well, and then you got to wonder, what was that city comprised of? Was it a walled city? Did it have tents? Evidently, it wasn't substantial enough to survive as far as archaeological terms, at least not well enough to be identified. There's a couple of...
at least not that we found.
Right. Well, there's a few places
buried.
that... Well, there's some ideas of it might be this place where they're digging, or it might be that place, but nobody can say for sure. So there's not enough identifiers within those tells that where they're digging to let us know. We also know that it's far enough away from the Philistines, and we're going to find this out later on, that the Amalekites felt secure enough to raid Ziklag. Mm-hmm. So that tells you something about how far away it was. It kind of reminds us back when the tribe of Dan picked up and moved in the last part of Judges. So might go back and review that episode. But the idea that a city can belong to a part of a nation, but still be far enough away that the nation can't protect it was very common. And it's also the reason why all this is important. I'm not just going off on a random, here's a list of facts about Ziklag, but it's a clue as to the dating. Because notice what the author says about it. He says it belongs to the kings of Judah to this day. So we know that it was at least edited after the division of Israel to the northern and southern kingdoms.
Sure.
So it belongs to the kings of Judah, but it's before the exile, because the earliest possible date. So this makes the earliest possible date the reign of Rehoboam, which is the son of Solomon. So kind of gives us some idea. It had to be written somewhere between Rehoboam and going into his exile. So verse 7, the number of days, and by the way, I say all that because a lot of people go, well, how can we possibly know when this was written? This is just one of these clues that you can find if you're reading closely. So verse 7, the number of days David lived in the country of Philistines is 1 year and 4 months. And so David's not going to return to Israel until he becomes king. He's going to stay with the Philistines. And that's pretty much what all that verse has to tell us. Verse 8, now David and his men went up and made raids against the Geshurites, the Girzites, the Amalekites, for these were the inhabitants of the land from old, as far as Shur to the land of Egypt. So, David's not sitting idle. He might not be able to claim the throne yet, but he's already doing the work of a king. These are all people groups that the king was supposed to take care of. He's doing what Israel had failed to do in the conquest. Because if you go back to Judges, go back to the book of Joshua, they were only partially successful with those raids and with taking over the land. And he is proving, and this is the other big point, he is proving that the complete conquest of Canaan was possible.
Yep.
Because he's doing it with 600 men. Joshua commanded 30,000 men. And so that was from the number in Joshua 8:3, where they attack Ai. And actually, those 30,000 men were selected from among that army. That's not even the totality of Joshua's army. So here's David with 600 men versus what Joshua had. There was no excuse for the fact that Canaan was not properly conquered and subdued at that point in time. The other thing David's proving is God is faithful to fulfill his promises. Yes, hundreds of years have passed since God made this promise back to Joshua at the beginning of the book of Judges, but David is only just now realizing the totality of what God had promised them. And even if you want to go back further, this is what God promised to Abraham. So even if it seems to take forever, like when I let God dry my dishes, when it seems to take forever, God's still going to accomplish all that he promises.
Right.
So I also want to take a moment to look at the people groups named. The Geshurites, the first mention we have of them is in Deuteronomy 3:14. they're mentioned in connection with the defeat of King Og.
Hmm.
And now, if you remember, King Og was the giant king. He was a remnant of the Rephaim. His iron bed measured 13 feet by 6 feet. So, that's a pretty good size bed, even by today's standards. This is the same size bed that we find in ziggurats, where the fertility rituals were conducted. The idea that the god would come down and he would have ceremonial sex with the women who were there, and this was going to ensure the fertility of the world, both in crops and in livestock and all of that stuff. The Gerishites lived at the border of Bashan, and the tribe of Manasseh's borders extended to the land of the Gerishites. So this Bashan, if you've done any study, you followed Dr. Heiser at all, you're going to know that is really, really linked with the Rephaim. It's linked with the giants, evil demonic forces. So we find in Joshua 13:2 that God tells Joshua specifically, you need to take them out. And in Joshua 13:13, it says specifically they were not taken out, and they lived among the people to the day that the book of Joshua was written. So they were there. This is the next and last time we hear of them. So we hear of them in Joshua, and then we hear of them here again. This is it. This is the only time they're mentioned in the Bible. And so, David does what Joshua was supposed to do. The Gerasites, we have no idea who these people were. This is the only place in the Bible that they're mentioned. The Septuagint completely just says we don't know who they are. Just leave them out. It's not a big deal.
That's funny.
Yeah, we don't have to include them. Some have claimed that it's a misspelling of another name, but in the Hebrew we find two forms of names, and the first form is actually bracketed.
Okay.
So we know that it's very intentional that it's kept in there. You wouldn't correct a misspelling of the word with another misspelling.
Right.
So whoever corrected the first spelling felt like they knew how to spell it correctly. They knew what they were talking about.
Okay.
What we do know about them from this context alone is that they lived between Shur and Egypt, and they were inhabitants of the land of old. And so this sort of thing kind of bothers critics of the Bible because they see it as an addition of a new name to, kind of, who are these people? We're going to mention them now because it's convenient. And so it's kind of must be a mistake or a contradiction. But it's not. Most of these kinds of things have really a lot of possible solutions that are really simple. This isn't just a writer introducing a new name because they want to make it sound like David's doing more than he was, or inflate the story. But names change over time. I mean, that's just a fact. The little town we grew up in had, I don't know how many names. I know Three Rivers was one name of it. It's OK now, OKAY. I forget what other names it had, but it had several different names before.
Why would you go from Three Rivers to OK? Did people get tired of writing two whole words for?
I have no idea. That's the kind
Save on ink.
You're right.
I don't know.
Sounded a lot more like Oklahoma. Led to a lot of confusion. But
yeah, I don't know. That's weird. I'm sorry. I guess, but we're not the Oklahoma History Podcast. Sorry.
Right. No, but I mean, the thing is, names do change. New York, was New Amsterdam. I only know that because the song Istanbul was once Constantinople. Names change over time, and a large amount of time has changed. It has passed since Deuteronomy to Joshua, and even more from Joshua to Samuel. And so there's a good chance that what the writer is here is using the name most familiar with his audience. He's not using an older name because his audience wouldn't know who that was.
Right.
So the other possible thing is that tribes became known by their most prominent clan. And so the most prominent clan was known by the name of their most prominent member. So if you had an ancestor who, was a fierce warrior or did something amazing or great, their name might displace the name of, somebody who has gotten forgotten in the sands of history.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Well, and this is the thing, when you really stop and think about it, most of these things have simple solutions. And not to mention, again, people groups are often known by different names depending on who was talking about them.
Mhm.
And, there was a road, not to make this all about our history, but I think people kind of get this. There was a road that ran between two towns, one OK and Porter.
Mhm.
If you lived on the OK side of it, it was Porter Road because it took you to Porter.
Yeah.
But if you lived in Porter, it was the OK Road.
Right.
So, depending on what perspective you had, really depends on what you might call something. And it could be a particular subset within the Gerishites. So you have the Gerizzites, the Gershites, sorry. The names are so close. You see how close they are. Like, I'm confused.
Well, they're not really easy names to say anyway.
Yeah, so. Our Western mouths don't really like to wrap around them very well. But, this is, again, not an issue or a reason to distrust the Bible. The other people group mentioned the Amalekites. The first time we encountered the Amalekites, we need to remember that's back in Genesis 14:7.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the battle of the four kings in which Lot was taken captive and Abraham rescued him. In Exodus 17:8-16, the Amalekites attacked Israel during the Exodus. They are the ones that when Moses had to have his arms held up by Aaron and Hur, this is who they were fighting.
Now, a quick question. When Moses, not Moses, the other one, Abraham, when he went into battle, he had 300 men. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
So is there anything to David having 600, like double the number of what Abraham has?
It did not occur to me. Knowing the way the Bible uses numbers, I would not be surprised.
Okay.
But I didn't study that, but it would make sense to me. 3 is the number of accomplishment. You add 100 to that, then it's full, complete, total accomplishment. 600 actually is the number of man.
Yeah,
because we're created on the 6th day. So this could be, the humanity side of things coming through. I don't know, because, like, again, now you got my brain whirling around.
Well, because you have Abraham. He was able to be successful with 300 men. And you have David with double that number, so he's could be even more successful. I don't know if that's
well. But at the same time, what's really weird is where I'm heading. And again, this is us just throwing things out there and recording it, which is probably dangerous.
Yeah.
But David during this time, he's not talking to God. There's been no appeal to God. I mean, we assume because it's David, there has to be some conversation, but not enough for the writer of Samuel. So in the fact that this is 6 and the number of man, is this talking about things that David's doing simply as a man? He's outside of God's territory. He's not, he's been compelled to worship other gods at this point in his life.
I don't know.
But these are the questions that you and I have always asked.
Well, I know, but I wonder if he may not be compelled to worship other gods, necessarily, but
it's David. It's probably hyperbole.
What he was saying that other people are telling him to go worship other gods, but based on what he's written in the Psalms, I don't think he's really necessarily.
He's not making sacrifices at the local temple.
That's my assumption.
Yeah,
but.
I think he was really making a nod towards the custom of the day. When you changed addresses, you changed kings. And when you changed kings, you changed gods. Because the kings were the representative of the gods. So even paying taxes, and you remember, this is a debate going on in Jesus' day. Is paying taxes worshiping Caesar?
Right.
And,
and the other thing, it could possibly be even when he goes in and asks for a whole city. It could be, as far as that's concerned, like, hey, I need this to be an Israel address so that we can worship God.
Yeah.
So that we're not having to live in the Philistines' land.
Yeah. And so we've got all of these things at play. So it's not just a simple story of, David went and camped someplace else until he could come back home. He's not spending the night with a friend until mom and dad cool off.
Right.
He is trying to work out his destiny and his identity within this larger framework where his whole society has a cosmological view that encompasses the spiritual realm and the spiritual ramifications of each and every daily event.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of the spiritual realm and the physical realm being separate was something that they had no idea about.
Right.
It never even occurred to him. So the idea that he could go in and say, hey, I need you, the Philistine king, our sworn enemy, to give us a city where we can live. He could very well see that as a kind of symbolic conquest of the Philistines, and a bloodless one at that.
Right.
Which, I mean, how like God? I mean, so many of the battles that Israel had to face when they appealed to God, God opened the doors and supernaturally created a way for them to win without ever drawing a sword.
Right.
So, and we're going to get into some more of those as we get into the Book of Kings. Those are fun. But
I mean, violence isn't always the best way to do what God wants you to do.
Despite what some people are trying to tell us online, you are 100% correct. Sometimes that be still and know that I am God really means be still,
Mm-hmm.
and now prayerfully and wisely discerning when those moments are, that's on us.
Right.
So, but back to the Amalekites. The Amalekites, like I said, we saw them in Exodus where they were attacking Israel. They specifically were told that they attacked the ones behind. And when you're traveling in a big group like they were in the Exodus, that's going to be your children.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be your elderly. That's going to be the sick.
The people who can't keep up.
Yes, this is not the warriors who can defend themselves. And so this was seen as a very cowardly act. And in Numbers 24:20, Balaam, when he prophesies, he talks about Amalek and he says they're first among nation, but it's going to be utterly destroyed. They're facing utter destruction. And in Deuteronomy 25:17, God commands that once settled in the land of Israel, Israel should go back and take vengeance on Amalek for what they have done to Israel. Because remember, here's what I love, and most people don't realize this. In the Bible, throughout the Bible, this is not something that originated with Jesus. You don't hurt the defenseless.
Right.
God is always about protecting the defenseless. So if you hurt the defenseless, you're his.
Mm-hmm.
And, he does not take it lightly when we hurt the innocent. And he tells Israel, when you get there, when you've gotten established and you've got, cities built for your elderly and children and disabled to stay in, then I want you to go out and blot out the memory of Amalek from the earth.
Right.
And when Saul did not do that, when Saul failed to do that, that is when God said, nuh-uh, you did not protect the innocent. You did not avenge the innocent. You aren't fit to be my king. And so then we encounter them several times in Judges. But they never attack on their own. They're always paired up with somebody in Judges because they're not a brave nation. And so we're connected right back to that story of in chapter 15 where God tells Saul, hey, you need to do something about this. And so there's very, very little direct information in the Bible. In many ways, their memory was blotted out. All we have is this title and a couple of stories. And there is a suggestion out there that possibly they're the descendants of Esau because he did have a grandson whose name was Amalek. But it's kind of hard for Abraham to fight King Amalek whenever that's his grandson,
right,
who hadn't been born yet.
Sure.
So, and plus we're told directly that they are among the first nations predating any nation that descended from Esau. So,
and maybe it just kind of goes to show you how entrenched Esau was with the culture that he's naming his kid after them.
Exactly. So yeah, because when you start having those crossover names, now we're saying, hey, we're identifying with this particular people group that we may not have originated from. And so, we're given the setup specifically to help us remember what was supposed to have been accomplished whenever they entered Canaan. But we're also being given the setup so that we can contrast David with Saul. David is not going to shy away from the biggest enemies that Israel has. David's going to go after them, and he's going to go after them hard. So, verse 9, and David would strike the land and leave neither man nor woman alive, and he would take away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, the garments back to Achish. this is a hard verse.
Mhm.
There's, like you said, we've got all of those questions about why is David exempt from what Saul was commanded to do? You know, one of the things that I think might be going on here is David's a fugitive on the run.
Mhm.
David is not in the same situation with Saul, who has a palace, who has a standing army, who has fields and crops that he can harvest, or cattle that he can slaughter for food. David is hanging on by the skin of his teeth.
Right.
One wrong move and he's dead. And not only is he dead, the 600 people, the marginalized, the misfits, in many ways, according to societal standards, they're the ones behind who
Sure.
are with David, just like the people that Amalek took out. But there's this idea that has been proposed that this is a form of harem, that devotion to God.
Right.
But the fact that David is keeping the animals alive tells you that's probably not. And it's even more problematic to read it as the harem whenever you've got him taking them to Achish,
Right.
which is basically a sacrifice,
Mm-hmm.
an offering to this king, and this king who represents another god. And that becomes the basis of these questions
Yeah.
that we have.
A lot of questions.
And yeah, well, and this is why one of the principles that the rabbis drew out of this is that when you're in your land and you're protected and someone asks you to honor a foreign king or a foreign god, you shouldn't do it.
Mhm.
But if it is a matter of life and death, you're allowed. They drew it out of this story here because David is using it to stay alive.
Fair enough. Yeah.
And, and of course, all rules of the Torah pretty much can be suspended for the preservation of life.
Right.
And this is the other reason this is so problematic is the author gives us nothing.
Mhm.
He doesn't give away one single thing. He doesn't approve of it. He doesn't disapprove of it. And, what David is doing in relation to the Torah is never clarified. And the thing is, when I read through commentaries, and I read through so many of them
Mhm.
in different articles, nobody offered a solution that did not still have significant problems. So I'm not even going to begin to pretend that I'm going to say, oh, God was okay with it because the most popular solution was God was okay with it because David had to do it to stay alive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I guess that would make sense. I mean, given what we know about suspending the Torah for saving life. So yeah.
That's the only thing I can come up with. But that's and I think that's about the only thing anybody else has come up with. And I would hate to think that I thought I was smarter than anyone else.
Well, I guess that goes. I mean, if that is the case, then that goes to the whole idea that God is contextual, that He looks at situations and He looks at the heart versus the mode, versus the action. Because Saul was doing it to self-aggrandize, and David might be doing it to to save his people, could be to pay rent, something of that nature, or to that, we don't have anything about the agreement of, because he gave him the town, but did he give it, or was it, on credit?
Oh, right. And, I for me, one of the things I see in this is just a place of turmoil in David's life. Because when you think about it, he has, he's been anointed king. He's killed the giant. He's been a general in the king's army. He's led all of these successful campaigns. He married the king's daughter. And, he's the rightful heir to the throne. And even Saul at this point has acknowledged that David is God's chosen, but everything's fallen apart. And how does David even recognize his reality at this point in time as God's provision?
Right.
I would think that, well, I know if it was me, I can say this confidently. If it was me, I would be doubting everything at this point in time.
Sure.
And what I love about David is, despite that this is a a time of doubt for him, he can't resist who he is. He is still the warrior king, and he's still fighting God's enemies because this is what he's been called to do. And this is what he's been made to do. And there's this drive within him. You don't take this kind of insult to God, that your family, your history, without, making some kind of attempt to right that. And so for me, I think that shows that despite the fact there's confusion, he still has enough faith to act.
Right.
And he may not be acting completely in a correct way, but he is not just saying around, woe is me. He really is attempting to do the right thing. And so I do like that with him, because I think so often when our paths aren't clear, we have this tendency to just give up,
right,
and say, well, I just won't do anything. And David, I never see him doing that. He's always moving forward. Even if he's making the wrong decision, he's making a decision.
Yeah.
So, but I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap up, and we'll come back and we'll talk about what Achish's response is to all of this and why that's important. And
then we get into the Witch of Endor.
Yeah, that only took a few weeks to write those notes up.
Yeah, well, no, I'm excited. I know you got a lot of research in on that, and so it's going to be real interesting because, again, it's kind of a problematic passage. So.
Yeah, it's the Book of Samuel. Everything's problematic.
Yeah, well, let's we'll dig into that probably for us in a few minutes, for you guys next week. Thanks for being here. If you enjoyed it, come be part of the conversation. RavenCreekSC.com, Raven Creek SC on all the social media. We're looking forward to hearing from you, and thanks again, and we'll be back next time. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes, or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening, and don't forget to join us next week.